Most photographers that I teach already know the exposure triangle. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO. They can name them all and they can adjust them, but somehow their exposures are still a little bit off. It's not because they haven't learned enough. It's because nobody taught them what they're actually trying to achieve by changing these settings. This isn't about making your image brighter or darker. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to explain exactly what's happening when you take an image and how to protect the parts that matter the most. Once you understand that, the way that you shoot changes completely. I've been shooting in the field for more than 20 years now, and on day one of every workshop I run, I find almost all photographers are unsure of the same thing. What is the actual goal of my exposure settings? Not what are the controls, but what are you trying to achieve when you adjust them? And I'll admit it, when I started, nobody had asked me that question neither. The answer I got from every course, every book, every YouTube tutorial was the same. Aperture controls depth of field, shutter controls motion, and ISO controls sensitivity. And that's all true, those controls matter. But knowing what the controls do is not the same as knowing what you are trying to achieve by changing them. Here's the concept that changed every decision I make about how I expose an image. The right exposure is not about the right brightness. Nailing your exposure is about collecting the right information. When you press the shutter, your camera is not creating the finished photograph. It's recording light, it's gathering information that you will later shape into your final image. That's why exposure matters so much. Before you think about whether the photo looks nice on the back of the camera, you need to ask yourself a better question. Have I captured the information I need? Have I protected the highlights that matter? Have I given the shadows enough light so I can work with them? Have I created a file that will hold up when I get back to the computer? And this is where a lot of photographers get caught out, because the image on the back of your camera is not the file. It's only a preview, it's a JPEG interpretation of the data that your sensor collected. And depending on your screen brightness, your picture profile, and the light around you, that preview can be incredibly misleading. In bright sunlight, your screen can look dark and washed out, so you might be tempted to add exposure when the file already bright enough. In dim conditions, the opposite happens. The screen can make an image look brighter and better than it really is, so a file that looks fine on the back of a camera may actually be underexposed when you get it to the computer. This is why photographers who understand exposure stop looking at the image on the back of the camera as the measure of success. They start looking at the data. So exposure can feel super complicated, but to simplify it, I like to use this analogy. Think of your perfect exposure as this cup. The cup can hold a certain amount of information, and your job as the photographer is to fill it to the right level. So imagine we start here with the cup barely filled. In photographic terms, this is an underexposed file. I haven't collected enough light. The image might not only look dark, but more importantly, the file contains very little information. And when I try to brighten it later in post-processing, it starts to fall apart. Noise floods into the shadows, color accuracy suffers, and texture just breaks down. That's what happens when you simply do not give the camera enough light to work with. So we add more light. And this is the bit that really matters. I want to keep adding light until the file's as full of information as I can make it, not randomly brighter, not just nicer on the back of the camera, fuller, richer, and more useful. But there is a limit. If I keep going and I overfill the cup, water spills out. And in photographic terms, that's blown highlights. That's detail in the sky and in the bright clouds gone. So the goal is to fill the cup as much as you can without spilling it. Enough light to create a strong file, but not so much that you lose critical highlight detail. Keep that image in your head. Every decision we make today comes back to it. So the first way to control how much light enters into your cup is your aperture. It's just like a tap, the physical opening in your lens. Wide open, more light comes through. Narrowed down, less light. Apertures measured in f-stops. A small f number is a wide opening, and a large f number is a small opening. The numbers are backwards, and that's one thing that can trip up a beginner, but the reality is, it's just maths that you don't have to understand. Just commit to it. f2.8 is wide open. f16 is closed down. Aperture also controls depth of field, which is how much of the scene sits in focus from front to back. Wide open at f2.8 is a shallow depth of field. Your subject's sharp and the background dissolves softly. Aperture is your first creative decision. It defines the image's visual character before anything else. It's the setting that has the most to say about how the photograph looks, which means for most shots, it's where you start, not where you end up. The second way to control how much light goes into the cup is how long you leave that tap running. And that's your shutter speed. Aperture controls the size of the opening, but shutter speed controls the time that it's open. It decides how long your shutter is open and your sensor is exposed to and collecting light. With a fast shutter, motion is frozen. Slow shutters of 1 second, 10 seconds, 30 seconds and more, everything that moves in your frame blurs across it. A waterfall becomes silk, stars become trails, traffic becomes streams of light. Neither's correct, they're just different images with different intents. For wildlife and fast-moving subjects, shutter speed is often the first decision to lock in, not aperture. I'm watching a bird of prey come in low over the water. My priority isn't depth of field. I need a fast shutter or the shot is gone. In those situations, shutter speed is my non-negotiable. Everything else is adjusted around it. For landscapes, shutter becomes a creative instrument. I want to show the movement of water, I'll slow it down deliberately. The shutter isn't managing light, it's making an artistic choice about time. The third control is ISO, and this is where the cup analogy changes just a little bit. Aperture's the size of the tap and shutter speed is how long you leave that tap running. ISO is more like changing the size of the cup. At a low ISO, like 100, you're working with a really big cup. You need more light to fill it up, but when you do, you usually get the cleanest file with the most information. When you raise the ISO number, it's like making the cup smaller. You don't need as much light to get a usable exposure, which is incredibly helpful in low light, but the trade-off is that the file can become noisier, especially in the shadows. So for me, ISO is usually the last control I reach for. Aperture defines the visual character, shutter speed captures the moment, ISO helps me close the gap when the other two decisions are already made. And honestly, I used to be far more conservative about ISO than I needed to be. Most photographers are, but here's what my 20 years in the field has taught me. The bigger enemy is not high ISO, it's underexposure. Pulling heavily underexposed shadows up in post can create far more visible noise than simply choosing the ISO you needed in the field. You're not saving image quality by keeping ISO low if the result is a file that you have to drag up 2 stops in editing. You're actually doing the opposite. Keep ISO as low as the conditions allow, but don't let the fear of it cost you capturing the moment. If your goal is to collect the right information, not just get a pretty preview, then you need an honest tool to tell you how you're doing. And the LCD on the back of your camera is not that tool. In bright sunlight, the screen makes everything look darker than it is. Under the night sky, everything looks brighter. The screen is your mood board. It's your guide. It's not a reliable tool to judge your exposure. The histogram is the most reliable tool you have to judge your exposure. The histogram is a graph that your camera can display live or after the shot. The left edge over here is pure black and the right edge is pure white, with everything in between representing differing tones. What you're looking for is data that sits in this central range, without spiking hard onto either wall. Data crushed against the left wall results in clipped shadows, pure black with no recoverable detail. Data clipping towards the right wall means that you've blown the highlights, pure white all detail gone. In landscape work, I obsessively watch the right side. Blown highlights in a sky or in a bright area of your image are never recoverable. Slightly dark foreground, in a RAW, I can bring that back. So I'll push my exposure as far towards the right as I can without touching that wall. And here's a tip that you can take out into the field that makes a massive difference. Shoot with a flat picture profile. A neutral or flat picture profile reduces the contrast in your preview, giving you a more accurate representation of what the sensor is actually seeing. Most photographers shoot on standard or auto profiles, which apply contrast and saturation to the preview. That preview can be misleading. It doesn't always represent the RAW file. Drop to a flat profile and your histogram will be a much more reliable guide. The goal is not to make the image look perfect on the back of the camera. It really does. If I'm protecting bright clouds or strong light in the sky, the image might look dark on the LCD, and that's okay, because I know I've captured the highlight detail and I can shape the rest of the image later on. That's not a compromise, that's a correct exposure for the file I'm trying to build. The histogram tells you the truth. Trust it always over the screen. Now, if you don't already have your own, let me give you a practical framework for making conscious exposure decisions in the field. A sequence that pulls everything together and delivers the one thing nobody taught you in a form that you can actually use in the field. Step one, we need to ask ourselves, what does this image need to do? Before you touch the dial, before you even lift your camera, we need to ask what the photograph requires. Are we freezing motion or showing it? Do we need a depth of field or do we need selective focus on our subject? Are we collecting information in challenging light? The answer here tells us which of the three controls matters the most right now. Step two, we lock in our priority. Here are some examples. For a landscape, aperture first. We're choosing depth of field, usually starting at f8 or f11. That's our creative anchor for making our next decisions. But for wildlife, shutter speed first. We're protecting that decisive moment. 1/1600th of a second or so minimum for fast movement, and that's got to be a non-negotiable. Step three is to set our second control. For landscape, shutter speed next. Are we shooting on a tripod? Is there motion that we want to show or freeze? This is a creative decision that can completely change the image's feel. But for wildlife, aperture's next. Usually wide open or one stop down, pulls our subject cleanly away from the background, but still maintains sharpness. Step four is to adjust the ISO until the histogram sits where we need it. We need it as low as the conditions allow, but as high as they require. Check the histogram, not the screen. Push it as far right as we can without clipping and make sure that cup is filled completely. And this is not always a perfect one-pass loop. Sometimes you make a choice, you check the histogram and realise something's shifted and you have to make another adjustment. That's normal. Everything in photography is a compromise. More depth of field might mean a slower shutter speed than you're willing to accept. A faster shutter speed might mean a higher ISO than you're willing to accept. Protecting the highlights might mean accepting a dark foreground and so forth. The skill's not in finding some magical, perfect setting straight away. The skill's in knowing what matters most for the photograph you're trying to make, checking the file honestly, and then balancing the compromises until you have the strongest exposure for your final image. Your exposure was never wrong because you didn't know the controls. You already knew the controls. It was wrong because you were given 3 dials without the question that they're designed to answer. What are you actually trying to achieve? What information does this image need? And how do I fill that cup correctly? Honestly, for the file, not just for the preview. When you stop adjusting settings until something looks right on the screen and start making deliberate decisions about your file and what it needs to contain, that's when exposure becomes a part of the creative process. And that's when it becomes yours. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped. Until next time, stay safe and keep shooting.